Madison Square Garden slowly dims after a long, exhausting Knicks game. The stand's lights go out row by row, leaving only the faint white glow from the broadcast booth illuminating the face of the 80-year-old man sitting quietly. Walt Clyde Frazier, New York's immortal icon, still holds the microphone, his hand trembling slightly but his eyes still bright, reflecting the wooden court where he once forged a legend. For half a century, his name has been part of the city's soul. He was the maestro who led the Knicks to 2 NBA championships in 1970 and 1973. The hero of the legendary Game 7 with 36 points, 19 assists, and 7 rebounds, a performance sports historians call the most perfect in finals history. 6-time All-NBA team, 7-time All-Star, 7 consecutive seasons on the league's best defensive team, he turned basketball into art, composure into a weapon. When the Garden's lights blazed, the crowd once chanted, "Clyde, Clyde," every time he stole the ball and launched a pass as beautiful as poetry. But Walt was more than a player. He was a cultural icon. His vibrant suits, tilted fedora, and Puma Clyde sneakers made him a pioneer who brought fashion to the court. After leaving the hardwood, he never left the Knicks, continuing as the voice of MSG Networks, where his rhyming phrases like posting and toasting, swishing and dishing became the familiar soundtrack for millions of fans. At 80, Frazier is a rare legend honored in the Hall of Fame twice, as a player and as a broadcaster. Yet, when the Garden falls silent, he sits alone. His trembling hand on the silver microphone, his hoarse voice whispers, "For 50 years, this was my home." The empty seats before him reflect half a century of lights and loneliness. He touches the scratched championship ring, as if trying to feel the heartbeat of his youth again. Outside, the city still dazzles, but for him, each light recalls someone who's gone, a grandstand now aged. His body trembles, his eyes blur, his voice rasps, but in those eyes burns a quiet fire, the will of a man who overcame poverty, prejudice, injuries, and obscurity to stand tall with dignity. The broadcaster's voice rises, like a farewell among the empty seats. Walt Frazier's tragedy isn't that time stole his youth, but that it took the world that once called his name. Atlanta, summer of 1945. The sun scorches the old wooden houses in the city's south side, where red dirt roads kick up dust under the feet of black kids playing ball. Among them is a lanky boy, barefoot, in tattered pants, clutching a cracked leather basketball, running tirelessly on the sandy court behind Howard High. That's Walt Frazier, the eldest of 9 siblings, his father a carpenter, his mother a maid for a white family across town. Their small home sits at the end of an alley where the train's nightly rumble is the only sound breaking the stifling silence of a South still bound by racial segregation. Walt grew up with his mother's words, "Don't look at what you don't have. Work with what you're holding." For years, what he held was just an old ball patched with tape. But to him, it was the whole world. At school, Walt was an honor student and an all-around athlete. He loved football, playing quarterback, throwing farther and more accurately than anyone his age. But at the first tryout, the white coach shook his head. "Too smart for a colored boy," he said, picking a white kid instead. Walt stood still, the ball slipping from his hand, rolling through the red sand, brushing the coach's shoe before stopping. No one picked it up. That was the first time he understood that, in this South, talent wasn't enough to be seen. That night, his father said little, only, "This world isn't fair, but don't let it make you forget your worth." Walt didn't cry. He went to the backyard, grabbed the ball, and threw it against the wooden wall until its leather wore thin. From that moment, silence became his first opponent. "Silence was my first opponent," he'd later say. Not people, but the cold silence of injustice, of being treated as if he didn't exist. In the years that followed, that boy still ran on the red dirt court, in worn-out shoes, dribbling through darkness and taunts. Basketball became Walt's refuge. When the ball hit the ground, it made a real sound, a living sound, a sound of defiance. He played alone for hours under the midday sun, sweat mixing with red dust, eyes closed, to imagine he was at Madison Square Garden, heard through an old radio. No one clapped, no one watched. Only the ball's echo off the brick wall and his own breathing. Sometimes, neighborhood kids stood by, mocking, "Hey, Clyde, who do you think you are?" He didn't answer. Each time the ball bounced back, he dribbled again, as if responding with silence. Walt grew up in that adversity, in a world where a black kid wasn't allowed to dream big. But those limits forged his discipline. He learned to observe, to stay calm, to turn silence into strength. When called the invisible kid, he just smiled. In his school journal, Walt wrote, "If they don't see me, I'll make the ball speak for me." And that ball, torn and stitched dozens of times, became the symbol of a childhood robbed of light, yet still burning inside. Each morning, passing the white church, Walt saw kids in clean clothes with new leather bags, while he was worn and scratched. He didn't envy, just lowered his head and thought, "One day, they'll have to remember my name." In the darkness of that barrier, filled south, his dream quietly grew, not a dream of wealth, but of being seen, heard, recognized as human. Every night, as his mother sang his siblings to sleep, Walt went to the backyard, where a worn wooden board bore the marks of thousands of shots. The faint streetlight lit the face of the 3-year-old, his eyes holding a different light, the light of someone determined not to be forgotten. His hands gripped the old ball, trembling with fatigue, but he kept shooting, kept believing that somewhere out there was a place for him. A place that didn't ask about skin color, only, "Can you play?" And though no one answered, he kept practicing, kept dribbling, kept living. In a world that never welcomed him, Walt Frazier began learning to create his own light from the darkness around him. When the bus left Atlanta, Walt looked back through the dusty window, watching the wooden houses and red sand court fade. He was 18, carrying a bag of old clothes and a small radio his father had taped together. His destination was Southern Illinois University, a name as foreign as another world. He'd never left Georgia, never seen snow, never felt cold that numbed his hands. But he went, because it was the only path out of the land that made him invisible. When the bus stopped in Carbondale, Illinois, icy wind cut through his thin jacket, and he realized this world wasn't any warmer. The dorm was old, the room cramped with a broken heater. Each night, Walt wrapped himself in a coat, sleeping fitfully as wind whistled through the door's cracks. Dorm food wasn't enough, and many days he ate only dry bread or instant noodles mixed with hot water. No friends, no one to talk to. Here, he wasn't hated, but no one cared either. Some white students politely avoided his gaze. Others smirked when he entered the dining hall. Walt was used to it. He learned to stay silent, to withdraw, to listen more than speak. Every afternoon he went to the gym alone. The empty arena echoed with flickering neon lights and the bounce of the ball. Walt practiced every shot, every pass, each touch on the floor a declaration, "I'm still here." In 1965, Southern Illinois wasn't a powerhouse. No one thought they'd reach a major tournament, let alone that a kid from Atlanta would make waves. But in the 1967 season, a miracle happened. Walt, now team captain, led the Salukis straight to the NIT, the era's most prestigious tournament. Each game he played as if every shot was his only chance to escape his past's darkness. When SIU reached the final against Marquette, the team had just a few dozen fans, but Walt played as if 20,000 were chanting his name at the Garden. He scored, defended, controlled the game's rhythm with uncanny calm. When the final buzzer sounded, the scoreboard read, Southern Illinois 71, Marquette 56. They were champions. Teammates hugged, shouted, tossed hats, tears streaming. But Walt stood alone in a corner of the court, sweat dripping onto the cold wood. When the silver trophy was handed to him, He held it with both hands, but no smile came. In that moment, memories of Atlanta's red sand court flooded back. His mother's call, his father's advice, the mocking, "Too smart for a colored boy." He'd overcome it all, but felt a strange emptiness. The small Madison Square Garden crowd that year, where the NIT was held, roared. But in the noise, he heard only silence. He learned early that victory doesn't erase loneliness. After the game, local papers mentioned him for the first time. Frazier, the quiet leader who changed the game. But back at the dorm, the room was still cold, dinner still noodles, and no one waited for him but a worn blanket. He looked at the trophy on the table, its silver reflecting his tired face. In his journal, he wrote one line, "They saw me tonight. I hope they remember." That was the first year he understood what it meant to have success without a home. In his 20s, at the peak of his first glory, Walt Frazier remained the lonely boy from Atlanta, used to winning in silence and carrying sadness with triumph. But in that void, another fire began to burn, not of fame, but of belief that, if victory couldn't erase loneliness, it could at least make the world look his way, and he vowed, no matter how many times the lights went out, he wouldn't let them swallow him again. In that cold room, with only the wind whistling through the window, a young man sat writing his dream, with cracked hands and a faded ball. A fire in the dark, quiet but enduring, like the path he was about to walk. After the brilliant 1967 season, Walt received the call that Southern black boys only dared to dream of. The New York Knicks selected him in the first round of the NBA draft. On the day he left Carbondale, he carried the NIT trophy wrapped in an old jacket and a pair of shoes with worn-out heels. His first ever flight took him to the city that never sleeps, New York, where the lights shone brighter than any dream but were harsher than any nightmare. When the plane door opened, the cold air and blaring car horns hit his ears, and he knew he was no longer in the South. Yet amidst that forest of lights, he felt strangely small. His first nights were spent in a cheap hotel near Madison Square Garden. He called Atlanta, but no one answered. His mother was working the night shift. His father was asleep, and his siblings had no phone of their own. In the cramped room, he sat gazing out the window at the street below, where neon lights reflected on the rain-soaked pavement. The sound of taxi horns, laughter, and radios from nearby bars blended into a noisy hum that made him feel lonelier than ever. "I've reached the place I dreamed of my whole life," he thought, "but why does it still feel so far from home?" His rookie season was a brutal test. Every small mistake on the court drew boos. Every missed shot sparked jabs from the press. New York had no room for the weak, especially for a quiet young player from Georgia dressed simply. "He's cold, arrogant," some papers wrote. In truth, Walt was just scared. Scared of the lights too bright, the crowd too loud, the fear that it could all vanish with one bad pass. He played well, but no one remembered. He made mistakes, and everyone pointed it out. Many nights, back in his room, he sat under a dim lamp, rewatching game tapes, hearing broadcasters say his name with doubt. Each word was a small cut, carving into his fragile confidence. But amid the sea of criticism, one person saw something different. Coach Red Holzman, a man with stern eyes and a calm voice, called him into his office after a heavy loss. He poured Walt a cup of coffee and said slowly, "You have something money can't buy. Composure. Don't let anyone take that from you." Red didn't praise often, but every word anchored itself in Walt's heart. For the first time since leaving Atlanta, he felt someone truly believed in him. From then on, Walt trained like a man possessed. He arrived at practice earlier than anyone, left last, studying every detail of movement and offensive schemes. He learned to see the whole court, to hear the balls bounce, to predict his teammates' paths. Every dribble was not just for technique but for patience. "I was still the kid from the South trying to prove I belonged," he recalled later. Indeed, in his mind, the barefoot boy from Atlanta still stood on that red sand court, looking toward the school gate, waiting for someone to call his name. Now, Madison Square Garden was that court, only with tens of thousands watching, ready to cheer or turn away in the same second. In the months that followed, he began to find the city's rhythm. Red Holtzman taught him that New York only respected those who stayed quiet and worked. Walt rose steadily, game by game. He wasn't the highest scorer, but he controlled the game's pace, making his teammates better. His quiet demeanor began to draw attention. "He's like he's playing jazz on the court," one broadcaster said. But even as the applause returned, Walt wasn't fully convinced he'd been accepted. Every night, back in his small room, he took off his shoes, looked at the scrapes on his knees, and thought of his parents in Atlanta, who never got to see him play on TV. One evening, after his first win in a Knicks jersey, he walked back to the hotel along 7th Avenue. The city was still bright, but rain fell heavily. He paused under an awning, staring into a shop window reflecting his image. Soaked athletic gear, a young face, tired eyes. The lights reflected back like a question, "Is this the dream I wanted?" He didn't answer. He only knew that every dream had its price. And in New York, that price was loneliness, pressure, and a faith he had to hold on to himself. But from that loneliness, Walt learned something neither fame nor money could teach. To stand tall in the garden, he first had to stand tall in his own silence. May 1970, Madison Square Garden became a cathedral holding its breath. The NBA Finals, Game 7 between the New York Knicks and the Los Angeles Lakers, was taut as a guitar string. Before tip-off, devastating news spread like a cold blade. Willis Reed, the captain, the giant, was badly injured and unlikely to play. The city was in chaos. In the locker room, Walt Frazier sat quietly, lightly spinning the ball, hearing the crowd outside chant, "We need Willis." He knew Reed would try to play, but no one was sure he could stay on his feet. In that moment, amid the sound of sneakers and the smell of athletic tape, Walt felt something shift. There was no one left to lean on. If the Knicks fell, New York would remember this failure forever. If they won, they'd never forget the man who saved the dream. When Willis Reed limped out of the tunnel, the crowd erupted. But minutes later, Reed could barely move, standing on the court like a symbol. All eyes turned to Walt. "Let's go," Red Holtzman said simply. Walt nodded, his gaze steady. He took a deep breath and released the ball. From the first play, his pass sliced through 3 defenders like a clean cut. The Knicks took the lead. The crowd exploded, but Walt didn't smile. He lowered his head, signaling for another play. Move by move, he conducted the game like a maestro writing his final symphony. No one saw him tire, no one saw him fear. They only saw a man moving with perfect rhythm, as if fate had composed the music for this night alone. The Lakers had Jerry West, Wilt Chamberlain, and Hollywood's glamour. But that night, the Garden belonged to Walt Frazier. He sank shots, passed, stole the ball, spun, and moved with the lightness of a dancer. Every play tilted the stands, every pass a needle stitching New York's tattered dream back together. When the scoreboard showed the unbelievable 36 points, 19 assists, 7 rebounds, 6 steals, Red Holtzman just crossed his arms, watching him with pride in his eyes. "That's it, Clyde," he whispered. "That's your masterpiece." When the final buzzer sounded, Madison Square Garden erupted. The city came alive again after 2 decades without a title. People hugged, threw hats, shouted until hoarse, "Clyde! Clyde! Clyde!" Thousands of voices poured onto the court like a flood. But amid the shower of white confetti, Walt stood still. Sweat ran down his cheeks, mixing with tears he didn't even notice. He looked at the scoreboard, 113-99, then up at the garden's ceiling. The lights shone down on the gleaming floor, reflecting in his deep eyes. He'd finally earned love, they'd say later, but it came at a cost. That cost was utter exhaustion. As the crowd cheered, he only wanted to sit. His body felt drained, his mind empty. The team won, the city rejoiced, but inside him was only silence. Perhaps because he'd fought half his life to be seen, and now, with the world watching, he didn't know what to do with the light. The trophy ceremony unfolded with blaring music. Walt stepped onto the podium, taking the cold silver trophy. The lights cast his shadow long across the floor, trembling like a question mark. He raised the trophy, not to boast, but as a thank you, for the nights of instant noodles, the red sand court in Atlanta, his quiet father, Red Holzman, smiling in the corner. When teammates hugged him, Walt nodded slightly. Silent. That night, after the celebration, he walked out of the garden alone. The cheers still echoed behind, but New York was starting to sleep. A light rain fell. He paused by a shop window, seeing his reflection, tired, radiant, alone. The neon lights flickered on the silver trophy in his hand, glowing like a dim moon. For a moment, he thought of his mother, his father, the people who said, "Too smart for a colored boy." Now they'd know his name. But instead of pride, he felt his heart empty. On the way to the hotel, a fan shouted, "Hey, Clyde, you did it!" He turned, gave a slight smile, nodded, then kept walking, his shoes heavy with rain. Under the nightlights, his shadow stretched on the wet sidewalk, curving like a question mark of his own fate. Is love only truly given when all peace is traded away? In that glorious victory, Walt Frazier became immortal, but also began to understand that immortality is sometimes just another way to be forever alone. In the 1,970 seconds, New York entered a golden era of basketball and of Walt Clyde Frazier himself. The city called him the coolest man in sports. On the court, he controlled everything with near supernatural calm. Off it, he was an icon of effortless style. They said every time he stepped onto the street, heads turned, a mink coat draped over his shoulders, a fedora tilted just so, gold-rimmed glasses gleaming under Manhattan's sun, and polished leather shoes like mirrors. When he drove his silver Rolls-Royce down Madison Avenue, crowds stopped just to peer through the window. "Clyde isn't just playing," a reporter wrote. "He's performing life itself." Frazier entered the best years of his career, but also the heaviest of his soul. The spotlight never dimmed, and he felt he could no longer be an ordinary man. From the moment he woke, someone was always waiting to capture how he dressed, how he smiled, even how he entered the locker room. Everything became a stage. Clyde, the name once a source of pride, now felt like a mask he wore all day. On winter nights, with snow blanketing the avenues, he drove through empty streets, lights reflecting off his fur hat, wondering, if I took all this off, would they still know me? After Game 7, New York crowned him the Prince of the Garden. Papers called him the Gentleman of Basketball. Brands lined up to make him their face, and he became the first NBA player with a signature shoe, the Puma Clyde. Each pair changed colors to match his outfits, a statement that fashion could play ball too. But at that moment, he began to feel tired. Nights were filled with parties, photos, autographs, then back to practice the next morning as if he'd never stop. The press adored him, women swooned, fans cheered every appearance. But when the parties ended and the lights went out, he was alone in a silent apartment. Everyone loved Clyde, an old friend said, but few ever knew Walt. In his upscale Harlem apartment, he placed an armchair by the window, overlooking the city's lights. Each night, he sat there alone, still in a tailored suit, posture straight as if on an interview set. But in his eyes, the lights outside no longer dazzled. They blurred like a spreading stain. He began to lose sleep. Some nights, he only heard the wail of ambulances, the ticking of a clock. On the table, a leather journal lay open. He wrote a few lines, regular as a ritual. I wear the crown, but it's heavy. At the peak of fame, Walt felt lost amid the glitter. On the street, people called Clyde, never Walt. Even teammates began to see him as an icon, not a friend. He didn't share his loneliness with anyone, not Red Holzman, not Earl Monroe, not Bill Bradley, because at the top, weakness wasn't allowed. He smiled in every photo, shook hands, cracked jokes, and played his role. But in the mirror each morning, he saw his eyes change, deeper, wearier, sadder. The Knicks' peak was when his isolation became starkest. At Madison Square Garden, he was an untouchable god. In life, he was a man adrift amid late-night parties, disco music, and strangers' faces. Once, a reporter asked, "Are you ever afraid the spotlight will fade?" He just smiled. "The light always fades. It's just that people don't want to look at the dark." That quote later became famous, but at the time, no one realized he was talking about himself. In 1973, the Knicks won their second championship. As the trophy was raised, he stood amid a sea of people, smiling for the cameras, but his heart was empty. The explosive joy of 1970 was gone, replaced by a sense of repetition, as if he were reenacting an old play. After the celebration, he left the party early, stepping out alone. The city stayed awake late, light snow falling on his fur coat. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke rise and dissolve. The glow of a bar's neon sign lit his calm face, and he thought, "I could leave any time, and New York would still shine like this." That night, he wrote in his journal, "Fame feels like a room without doors. People cheer outside, but you can't get out." And indeed, fame, like the soft fur he wore, was as warm as it was heavy. Each step in the spotlight was a step deeper into loneliness. In others' eyes, he was a legend, the standard of cool and class. But in his own reflected gaze, he saw only a man slowly losing what mattered most: peace. Walt Frazier's career entered a new chapter when Puma came calling. It was 1973, right after the Knicks' second championship, when New York saw him not just as a player but as a living icon. The German brand's director flew to Manhattan to meet Clyde, a name that had become synonymous with style. They talked about a signature shoe, lighter, softer, carrying the soul of a man both elegant and dangerous, like the basketball he played. And so the Puma Clyde was born, the first NBA shoe named after an athlete. On launch day, lines stretched around Madison Avenue just to see, touch, and wear what their idol wore. But that glory came at a cost. The shoe became an icon, and he, though he never said it, became part of the product. Even his shoes had to perform, a journalist wrote. Every game he switched colors: red, purple, yellow, green, tan. The shoes were no longer just for running. They were a marketing weapon. The pressure shifted from making shots to whether fans would talk about his shoe color. Before, he battled opponents. Now, he battled his own image. Puma wanted Clyde to be sharper, cooler, more perfect every time he appeared. No misstep, no wrong word allowed. Frazier, who grew up on Atlanta's red dirt courts, now had to calculate the hue of his suit and the shine of his shoes before stepping onto the court. He was paid hundreds of thousands, a fortune back then. But with every contract signed, a piece of his soul felt sold. He knew that one bad game, one moment of weakness, and someone else would take his place. The freedom that made him great became a luxury. "I used to play to win," he said. "Now I play to maintain." Each morning, he looked in the mirror, adjusted his tie, chose a fedora to match that day's Puma shoes. To others, it was style. To him, it was armor. Glittering outside, exhausted inside. When fans chanted, "Clyde, Clyde," he felt they were calling a character, not the real man. Slowly, Walt faded, leaving only Clyde, New York's living brand, the modern tragedy. He was loved not for who he was, but for what people wanted to see. One evening, after a Puma ad shoot, he stayed late in the studio. When everyone left, the neon lights reflected off a pristine red pair of shoes on the table. He slipped them on, stood before the mirror. They fit perfectly but felt foreign. "It looks like me," he thought, "but it doesn't feel like me." He remembered his first worn-out shoes in Atlanta, unnoticed, covered in sand and sweat. Now, his shoes were worth a house, but they had no soul. From 1973 to the mid-70s, Clyde was everywhere. Magazines, billboards, posters. He appeared with singers, models, athletes, the face of cool America. But the more famous he became, the more lost he felt. In a 1975 interview, asked if he feared fashion would overshadow basketball, he gave a faint smile. When the lights go out, both disappear. No one then understood he was speaking of a man suffocating in the perfection others imposed. On the court, he still played brilliantly, precise passes, poised stance, never raising his voice. But after each game, walking to the locker room, he felt no joy. Trophies, awards, money, handshakes, they passed through him without a trace. He began having strange dreams, running on the court but never touching the ball, crowds cheering but not calling his name. Waking up, it took him seconds to remember he was still Clyde. One late night, he wrote in his journal, "They say I'm free, but I've never felt more trapped. I have everything, and I'm nothing." The words trembled on the page, simple but heavy. In the dim light, the man who conquered New York sat silently, staring at the pristine Puma shoes by his bed, their silver logo glinting like a small knife. The fame that once saved him from darkness now pushed him closer to it. Walt Frazier, the boy who stitched his torn shoes to keep playing, was now trapped in shoes so perfect there was no room for himself. And in that dazzling beauty, the tragedy crept in. A legend turning into a brand, a man vanishing behind applause. In the summer of 1977, New York sweltered. In his Harlem apartment, Walt Frazier received a brief call from the Knicks management, a call that changed the rest of his life. They told him he'd been traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers. No thanks, no farewell, just a transaction on paper. After a decade of giving everything to the city, the hero of Madison Square Garden was sent away like an expired commodity. Walt hung up, sat still. Through the window, Manhattan's lights still blazed, the sound of cars echoed. But to him, the city suddenly felt foreign. It was exile in plain sight, he wrote later, a banishment in broad daylight. Cleveland greeted him with silence. No flashing cameras, no billboards, no Clyde, Clyde, chants that once shook the garden, just faded banners and a cold, small locker room. He walked in, hearing the squeak of new teammates' shoes, all eyeing him like a relic, a man who was a legend elsewhere. "They respected me," he said, "but they didn't need me." His first season with the Cavaliers, Walt tried to fit in. He still practiced early, wore crisp suits to the arena, kept the same polished demeanor. But inside, his body was betraying him. Mornings brought aching back, creaking knees, legs once like wind now heavy. Each jump sent pain shooting up his spine, a reminder, time spares no one. After games, he soaked in ice baths for hours, gritting his teeth. Doctors urged rest, but Walt just smiled. "I still owe this court a few more steps." But Cleveland wasn't New York. The arenas were small, the crowds sparse, losses piled up. When he dribbled, a few cheers rose, but not the sound that once brought him alive. In New York, every shot was an event. Here, it was just a play and a long night. When he left the court, no one watched. For the first time, he said, "I knew what it meant to age." He grew so lonely, he talked to himself. In his hotel room, under dim lights, he looked in the mirror and saw a stranger's face. Thick beard, early gray hair, tired eyes. He thought of the garden, Red Holzman, snowy nights when the city shouted his name. In Cleveland, snow fell, but no one called. He walked quiet streets, unrecognized. Sometimes, young fans approached, asked for an autograph, then said, "You played for the Knicks, right?" He nodded, smiled, but inside, it cut like a knife. Recurring injuries tanked his performance. Every step was a challenge. His knees swelled, his back felt clamped in iron. Once, during a game break, he couldn't stand. Teammates helped him up as the crowd looked on with pity. That night, in his room, he listened to rain hit the window, and knew the final chapter of his career was near. He wrote in his journal, "When you are young, the world bends for you. When you are old, it doesn't even look your way." Cleveland didn't hate him. They just had no memories with him. To them, he wasn't a legend, just a fading veteran. And in time, even New York began to forget. The Daily News stopped mentioning him, his posters replaced by younger faces. His Hassan Zero jersey remained, but the spotlight moved on. "New York moved on," he whispered, watching TV. "The lights stayed bright, but my name faded from the signs." After a season of constant injuries, he sat out nearly the entire next year. Coaches suggested retirement, but Walt refused. "I don't want to leave in silence," he said. He tried returning for a few games, but his body fought back harder each time. At 35, he knew he was no longer the Clyde of his glory days. In his final game, as the buzzer sounded, he stood mid-court, looking at the sparse crowd. No one knew it was his last. No goodbye, no tribute. He walked off quietly, towel in hand, shoulders trembling. That night, he drove alone across Cleveland's snowy bridge, the radio softly playing "What a Wonderful World." Louis Armstrong's raspy voice spoke for his heart. The world was wonderful, but not for those being forgotten. At a red light, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The glow of trailing cars' lights, like the garden's lights still chasing him. Then the light turned green, and it all vanished. That was how a legend left the stage. No applause, no fireworks. Just the sound of solitary footsteps in an Ohio winter. Walt Frazier, who once brought New York to its knees in awe, was now just himself, in the silence of a foreign city. But deep down, he knew, even as everything faded, one thing remained: dignity. He held it like a small flame in the snowy night, a reminder that he once shone, and even in oblivion, he was still himself. When Walt Frazier officially retired in the early 1982, there was no grand press conference, no farewell ceremony, no lights to see him off. He simply vanished from the schedule, like a song cut off mid-note. No scandals, no debts, no public tragedy, just absolute silence. After 2 decades in the roar of crowds, Walt realized the scariest thing wasn't failure, but when the world suddenly stopped calling his name. He had survived racism, injuries, pressure, but not silence. Harlem, where he returned, had changed. The 125th Street, once vibrant with jazz and laughter, was now cracked, covered in graffiti, shops shuttered by economic crisis. Post-Golden Era New York was sinking into chaotic years. The Knicks, the team he'd carried to glory, now languished at the bottom of the standings. Walt lived in a small apartment, walls lined with faded photos, heroic moments gone pale. On the table sat championship rings, trophies, yellowed newspapers. Each morning, he brewed coffee, opened the window to watch commuters, and wondered if anyone down there remembered who he was. One afternoon, walking through Times Square, he heard a sports announcer's excited voice from a loudspeaker, hyping the Knicks' new star. He stopped amid the crowd, looking up at a giant screen showing a young player celebrating. No one noticed the silver-haired man in a dark overcoat standing there. Walt smiled, whispered, "Good for him," and kept walking, blending into the sea of strangers. No one looked back. The garden he once ruled now belonged to ghosts. In his early retirement years, Walt tried various things to fill the void. He opened a clothing store, coached kids basketball, wrote a small book on lifestyle, but nothing made him feel truly alive. The court, once his home, now lived only in memory. Sometimes he drove past Madison Square Garden, looked at its glowing sign, and felt a lump in his throat. The house he'd conquered now echoed with others' voices. He wasn't jealous, just lost, like a stranger visiting his own past. Every night, he came home, turned on an old radio. Sometimes, it played classic games, a broadcaster shouting, "Frazier steals! Frazier scores!" The sound froze him. He closed his eyes, feeling the sweat on his back, the stands erupting. But when he opened them, only the wind whistled through the window. The room stayed cold, and he was alone. Walt tried to find a normal rhythm, but it wasn't easy. His life had been the pulse of crowds, lights, the bounce of the ball. When it all vanished, he didn't know what to hear. Old friends drifted apart. Willis Reed coached. Earl Monroe ran a business. Bill Bradley entered politics. He saw them sometimes, laughed, but when they parted, each returned to their own lives. Walt returned to his small apartment in silence. "I was never afraid of aging," he told a reporter. "I'm just afraid of not doing what I love." One winter night, snow fell heavily. Walt walked past the garden, hands deep in his pockets. The lights inside still glowed, lines of fans waiting to watch the Knicks. No one recognized the man slowly walking outside as the one who once set this place ablaze. He paused, looking through the glass. The wooden floor gleamed under the lights, young players darting across. He saw his younger self, the run, the shot, the eyes. Then the image faded. He gave a faint smile, turned away. His figure shrank in the snow, leaving only solitary footprints on the icy sidewalk. Back home, he opened his journal, wrote one line: "When the cheers stop, the echoes are all you have." He closed the book, set down the pen, and looked out the window where distant lights flickered like memories. He wasn't bitter, just sad. For perhaps that was the true cost of being a legend. When the applause fades, you realize all glory comes at the price of solitude. And Walt Frazier, once immortal in the garden's light, now learned to live in the darkness of his own silence. Then one day, in the mid-1980s, when Walt Frazier had nearly vanished from the basketball world, another phone call came. This time, it wasn't from a team but from MSG Network, the Knicks broadcast channel. They wanted him to try being a commentator. "You were an icon of the Garden," the director said. "Maybe you should tell people what the Garden used to be." At first, Walt hesitated. He didn't believe his voice still mattered, nor was he sure anyone wanted to hear it. But for some reason, perhaps a longing for the court or a need to return to the place that once called his name, he agreed. On his first day in the broadcast booth, he stood silently for a long moment. Below, the wooden floor still gleamed, the stands still buzzed. But this time, he wasn't in a jersey. Before him was only a black microphone, cold and quiet. During his first broadcast, many viewers were merely curious. "Clyde? He's still around?" But when he began to speak, the audience fell silent. His voice was low, warm, with the rhythm of jazz. He spoke like jazz, smooth, precise, and full of soul. Each of Walt's comments wasn't just game analysis but like rhythmic poetry. "He's posting and toasting, spinning and winning." He rhymed as if singing. Those phrases spread quickly across New York, making a new generation fall in love with the name Frazier, once only a tale from their parents. For Walt, the microphone became a crutch, a lifeline pulling him from the depths of depression. Talking about the game kept him from feeling dead inside, he admitted. Each game, each whistle, each shot made his heart beat in rhythm again. Madison Square Garden was still home, only now he didn't run on the hardwood but sat high above, delivering rhythm through his words. His new court was sound, not wood. Sound replaced footsteps. Words replaced passes. And the audience, whom he thought had forgotten him, now listened again. At first, Walt was awkward on camera. He spoke slowly, sometimes lost his voice, or paused mid-sentence as if swallowing memories. But the audience didn't mind. They felt the authenticity in his cadence. Unlike young commentators trying to stand out, Frazier spoke like a storyteller by a fireside, calm, unpretentious, with hints of poetry and philosophy. "Basketball," he said, "is rhythm, not chaos. You don't chase it, you flow with it." Each game became a song, and he was the musician, using words to recreate the emotions he once lived. Young fans began to anticipate his voice. When the Knicks scored, They echoed him. Swishing and dishing, shaking and baking. Each phrase was a joyful drumbeat, breathing life back into the garden's soul. Though he no longer ran, Walt still controlled the game with his voice. Rhythmic, sharp, just enough to hold the emotional pulse. In middle age, he rediscovered what fame, money, and fashion had stolen: connection. Now, no one needed to see him in a fur coat or driving a Rolls-Royce. They just needed to hear him. After work, Walt returned quietly to his small apartment. But now, instead of silence, the air still carried echoes of cheers, the hum of the microphone lingering. He felt useful, alive. Before, entering the garden made him feel older each day. Now, stepping into the booth made him young again. "I can't play anymore," he wrote in his journal, "but I can still feel the game." The new job saved him from the emptiness fame had left behind. Day by day, Walt returned to the audience, no longer a statue of a legend, but a companion on the airwaves. Each season, fans eagerly awaited his descriptions of shots, his pauses before the ball hit the rim, pauses that held their breath, then sparked laughter. His voice became part of the garden, like the squeak of sneakers or the sound of history unfolding. Years later, when asked about the moment that made him feel most alive, Walt didn't mention Game 7 of 1,970, the silver trophy, or the Rolls-Royce. He just looked at the court and said, "Every time I pick up the mic, I'm home again." The room fell silent. They understood. The man who'd lost his world had found it again, not through fame, but through his voice. And so, the Clyde of the spotlight became the Walt of sound. No need to perform, no need to be sharper, cooler, more perfect. He just needed to speak, to be real. His voice, smooth as a jazz riff, echoed through the garden across generations, a witness to a life that lost everything, then found itself again in the familiar sound of a ball hitting the floor. By the 2000s, Walt Frazier had reclaimed the place destiny carved for him. At the heart of New York, the voice of the Knicks, an icon of timeless cool. TV contracts, tribute events, ads, and his restaurant, Clyde's Wine and Dine, kept him in luxury. He drove a restored silver Rolls-Royce, wore vibrant tailored suits, collected over 400 pairs of shoes and hundreds of fedoras. On the surface, it was a dream life. Lavish, fulfilled, successful, but when the door of his Harlem apartment closed, silence fell heavy like a curtain. Luxury is loud in the day and cruelly silent at night. Each evening, Walt paced his apartment slowly. The walls were covered with photos, black and white frames fading with time. Willis Reed lifting the 1,970 trophy, Earl Monroe beaming, Bill Bradley waving to the crowd. He paused at each, lightly touching the glass. Many were old, some gone. The team that once owned New York now lives only in photographs, he whispered. Those who ran with him on the garden's hardwood now existed only in memory. On a corner table, a photo of the 1,973 Knicks team, all smiling, young, carefree. He lingered on it longer than usual, then turned away. Outside, New York still dazzled as ever, but to him, the city had changed. Harlem no longer echoed with late-night saxophones, replaced by police sirens and early closing bars. Walt walked the streets of his youth, now weathered by time. Sometimes, people recognized him. "Hey, Clyde!" And he smiled, signed autographs, posed for photos. But moments later, the bustle faded. He returned to his lavish apartment, opened a bottle of wine, turned on a warm lamp, and sat alone in an armchair by the window. The city's lights reflected in his glass, shimmering like fading memories. Every night, he turned on the TV. The Knicks still played, but they weren't the team he knew. Young faces, endless losses. Broadcasters still called him to the booth, recounting Game 7 of 1,970, the legend of Clyde. But when the cameras stopped, he was left with a silent room. Once, after a bad Knicks loss, he chuckled, voice hoarse. "That's still my team. No mockery, no bitterness, just a mix of pride and nostalgia." He lived in a strange loop, welcomed as a legend by day, lost in solitude by night. Award ceremonies, gala dinners, young fans seeking advice, all admired him, but none truly knew him. They knew Clyde, but Walt was alone. In a TV interview, the host asked, "Do you ever feel lonely?" He gave a faint smile. "Loneliness is part of success. I'm used to it." But he never was. When the lights dimmed, the apartment fell quiet, and that silence was heavier than any glory. He opened a drawer, flipped through old journals. The trembling words from years ago remained, "I wear the crown, but it's heavy." He nodded slightly, as if talking to himself, and it's still heavy. Sometimes, after broadcasts, Walt walked the garden's empty halls as the crowd left and stage lights dimmed. He moved slowly, touching the empty seats, hearing his shoes echo on the floor. "This sound," he said softly, "is still home." Each echo was a piece of his soul left over the years. Despite all the glory and oblivion, the garden remained the only place that made him feel alive. Then he returned to his Harlem apartment, where old photos stood silent on the walls. He sat, gazing out the window at Manhattan's lights reflected in the glass. In the distance, buildings twinkled like stars. He sipped his wine, smiled faintly. "We were lucky," he said, as if to read, "Monroe, Bradley, those no longer there. We had our time." In that moment, Walt Frazier was no longer a legend, no longer an icon, just an old man sitting with his past, grateful for having been loved, and quietly accepting that every light, no matter how bright, eventually gives way to darkness. Outside, Harlem's night stretched on. In the high-rise apartment, amid luxury and loneliness, Walt Frazier sat, the man who had everything but found peace only in memory. At an age when most think of rest, he still followed the orange ball, whispering to himself, "That's still my team." And somewhere, in the silence, the echoes of old crowds lingered, faint but enough to hold him, between two worlds, glory and solitude. By the 2010 seconds, time did what no opponent on the court ever could. It overtook Walt Frazier. He still sat each night in the Madison Square Garden broadcast booth, his warm, steady voice like the city's heartbeat. But around him, everything had changed. Willis Reed, the captain who lifted the 1,970 trophy with him, passed quietly. Earl the Pearl Monroe grew frail. Bill Bradley aged. Phil Jackson left the Knicks, and many others now lived only in photos. Walt remained, alone, like the last guardian of a bygone era. He outlived the team, the city he knew, even the music that once played his name. His New York was now a different city. Faster, louder, colder, the soul, jazz, and funk that once followed him through Harlem's streets had been replaced by electronic beats and ads. On social media, young fans knew Clyde through short video clips, his rhyming quips on broadcasts, but few truly understood who he'd been. In a world where fame lasts seconds on Twitter, Walt Frazier became a relic of a distant time, a legend living in an era with no room for quiet. Each morning he still chose a crisp suit, tied his tie, groomed his beard carefully. Time hadn't made him careless. "If you stop caring about how you look," he once said, "you start disappearing." Perhaps that's why, even in his 70s, he appeared vibrant, as if light were his only shield against oblivion. On broadcasts, fans loved his charm, his rhyming, swishing and dishing, posting and toasting, moving and grooving, like nostalgic music in a digital world. But when the show ended, when cameras shut off, Walt gathered his notes, removed the microphone, and left the garden in silence. No more lights, no more cheers, just the sound of his shoes on the hardwood. His old friends dwindled. He called Reed in 2019. No one answered. Weeks later, he learned Reed was hospitalized, then gone. Walt attended the funeral, standing at the back, saying nothing. He placed a white rose on the casket and walked away quietly. That night, back home, he watched the 1970 Game 7 on TV. Seeing Willis limp onto the court, tears welled up. Not for loss, but because he knew he was outliving those who'd built the legend with him. Surviving, sometimes, was its own punishment. In 2022, in Springfield, Massachusetts, he received the Kurt Gowdy Media Award, becoming one of the few inducted into the Hall of Fame twice, once as a player, once as a storyteller. When his name was called, the room stood and clapped. Walt smiled, bowed, in a vibrant purple suit as if defying time. He spoke briefly, thanking departed teammates, thanking fans for giving him a reason to go on. The moment went viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. He still got it. But that night, back in his hotel, he sat alone by the window, staring at the dark sky, and wept. He smiled for the cameras, then cried alone in his hotel room. In the mirror, he saw a man who'd lived through a century, from segregated Atlanta to blazing New York to the internet age. He'd survived it all, but each day lived was a day with fewer who understood him. Outside, they called him the legend. But inside, he was just Walt, still unaccustomed to the quiet. Sometimes, during broadcast breaks, he sat silently, gazing at the court below. Young players ran, fans cheered, phones snapped photos. No one noticed the old man in a floral suit up high, the one who'd made this place a kingdom. "This is their time now," he said softly. But after games, a few fans still approached, asking for photos, saying, "Clyde, my dad grew up watching you." Walt smiled, patted their shoulders, and said, "Tell him I'm still here." And indeed he was, like the last note lingering in a faded symphony, a lonely icon in a noisy era, a quiet figure in a rushing world. Walt Frazier, who once set New York ablaze, now preserved that light, if only through a voice, a smile, a memory. He'd outlived his team, the city he loved, his friends, even his era. And each night, when the garden's lights dimmed, he stood alone, looking at the hardwood, whispering, "I'm still here." Now, at 80, Walt Frazier still appears regularly on TV whenever the Knicks play. But behind the dazzling suits and calm smile, his body is beginning to betray him. Each step is slower, his knees creak, and his right foot, once gliding with the ball like the wind, now aches dully when he stands too long. His voice, once ringing like jazz on MSG broadcasts, is now hoarse and thinner, sometimes pausing mid-sentence to catch his breath. "I can still hear the crowd," he said softly in an interview. "But sometimes I'm not sure they can still hear me." The simple words carried a piercing sadness, for he knew time never spares those who've lived under the spotlight too long. Doctors urge him to rest, but Walt laughs, "If I stop talking, I'll disappear." That fear isn't of old age, but of the Atlanta boy who was once forced into silence because of his skin. Now, the same silence he fought as a boy was coming back for him. It no longer bore the shape of injustice, but the shadow of age, quietly stealing pieces of him. His voice, his feet, his eyes. Patricia, his partner of over 2 decades, is the only one who sees Walt not as a legend but as a frail old man. She says each morning he still tries to pick out a suit, tie a tie, but sometimes has to sit down mid-task from exhaustion. He jokes, but the pain shows when he sits down, she says. In the kitchen, he still brews coffee, still tosses out rhyming quips, but his eyes are dimmer. He uses reading glasses for the paper, and when the screen's light is too harsh, he squints, then falls silent. At night, Patricia helps rub ointment on his knees while Walt gazes out the window. The garden is just a few blocks away, its golden lights reflecting on familiar Harlem walls. "They're still playing," he whispers, "but I can't hear the ball hit the floor anymore." When a breeze slips through the window, he recalls 967, practicing alone in an empty gym, hearing only the ball's echo. Half a century has passed, and silence has returned, like a faded loop. Each broadcast requires double the effort, not just to keep his voice, but to keep the rhythm. Patricia listens from home, watching on TV. She says when Walt misnames a player or forgets the score, he laughs lightly, but afterward grows quiet. He's always afraid of being replaced, she admits. Not for fame, but because if they replace him, he's no longer part of the Garden. When the broadcast ends, Walt turns off the mic, leans back in his chair, and closes his eyes for a few seconds. The stage lights still shine on his vibrant suit, but beneath the fabric is a body struggling with each breath. He leaves the booth slowly, each step leaning slightly on the railing. Young staff nod respectfully, and he smiles, nods back, still as suave as ever. But beyond the door, his shadow is quiet and thin, like a fading beam of light. At night, he sits in the living room, an old recorder on the table. He plays a worn cassette, a small click sounding before his younger voice spills out, vibrant, strong, rhythmic. He's spinning and winning, swishing and dishing. Walt closes his eyes, lips moving faintly with each beat. In the dark, he hears the crowd, the squeak of sneakers, the distant chants of, "Clyde! Clyde!" His lips tremble, then curl into a smile. The smile of a man who's walked the full journey but isn't ready to leave the stage. Patricia stands at the door, watching him sit there, the man who once captivated a city, now listening to his own voice to feel alive. When the tape stops, he opens his eyes, gaze soft and distant. "Hear that?" he asks. "Back then I spoke like I was flying." She nods, tears welling. He sets the tape down, leans back, and says softly, almost a whisper, "I'm just afraid one day even this voice will forget me." Outside, New York hums and dazzles, but in the small Harlem room, Walt Frazier listens to his past. Each word, each breath, as if it's the last way to hold onto the light of a life gone by. Walt Frazier's Harlem apartment is like a museum of memories. The walls are covered with black and white photos. Him beside Willis Reed in the 1970 locker room, beaming next to Earl Monroe, Red Holtzman's hand on his shoulder after the finals. Each photo is a door to the past, where the chants of "Clyde, Clyde" still echo, but only in memory. On a shelf, 2 championship rings gleam under dim golden light. Beside them, handwritten fan letters from decades ago. Yellowed paper, faded ink, but still kept. "I live among shadows," he once said, "because they never leave me." But when Manhattan's artificial glow tires him, Walt escapes to his second home, a small villa by the sea in Street Croix, Virgin Islands. The house stands apart, white under Caribbean sun, windows opening to a vast blue ocean. Here, no one calls him Clyde. Neighbors know him as Mr. Walt, the old man in a silk robe, walking the beach at dawn with an old fedora. He walks the beach at dawn, talking to ghosts of teammates, of time. Each wave crashing feels like an echo from the distant garden, and each gaze at the sea recalls those who've gone before. Willis, Red, teammates, years now past. In Street Croix, Walt lives slowly. He tends plants, reads papers, plays old jazz on a record player. But despite the blue skies and calm sea, something unnameable is missing. The house is beautiful but empty. The dining table holds 2 cups, his and Patricia's, and sometimes only one is used. When she's in New York, he stays alone, watching the sunset stain the sea red, hearing wind through palm trees like distant crowd noise. At night, he opens the window, listens to the steady waves, and feels like he's talking to the past. The crowd loved Clyde, he once admitted, but no one ever really stayed with Walt. In his life, he never married. No children, few relatives. His days were filled with fans, teammates, admirers, but when they faded, he realized he'd never truly had a home. At 80, he looks around the room, seeing everything belong to Clyde, the suits, the Rolls-Royce, the photos, the articles, but Walt, the man behind the spotlight, is still searching for his place. Once, Patricia asked softly, "Do you ever regret not starting a family?" He laughed, voice hoarse. "I spent my life loving basketball, but basketball can't love me back." Each morning in Street Croy, he walks the beach at sunrise. Waves and seagulls blend into a mournful song. He whispers to the breeze, as if telling stories to those no longer here. "Red, you see? I kept my promise, still dressing sharp, still working, still not leaving the garden." Then he smiles faintly, gazing where the dawn's light hits the sea, shining like the old arena lights. At night, he sits on the porch, wineglass in hand, listening to the waves. Patricia sits nearby, reading. They rarely speak much. Sometimes he just rests his hand on hers, light as if afraid to break something fragile. She understands, for his eyes say it all. The eyes of a man who had everything, now seeking just a moment of peace. He spent a lifetime being everyone's hero, but no one's home. That's the gentle, bitter truth. He could make a city happy but never learn to keep someone by his side. As night falls, waves lap the shore. He stands, looks at the sea one last time before bed. The moonlight stretches across the water, a thin beam of light. He thinks, perhaps that's his path, long, beautiful, but walked alone. In the dark, the waves sound like a distant call, tender yet sad. He closes his eyes, hearing each crash, like the old crowd chanting, "Clyde! Clyde!" Harlem and Street Croy. Two worlds, two rhythms. One loud, one quiet, but in both, Walt is just a man seeking himself. At 80, with the garden's light a distant memory, he knows home isn't walls or a roof, but where love's echo lingers, in waves, in wind, in the memories of a man who made the world cheer, now talking to the shadows of time. In March, on his 80th birthday, Madison Square Garden glowed as if New York wanted to rewind time, bringing back the soul of the 1,970 seconds. In the stands, young faces mixed with silver hair, all rising as the familiar voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back number 10, Walt Clyde Frazier." Thousands roared his name, applause thundering against the dome. Above, a Knicks banner rose, Hasanezero shining amid countless streamers. The Jumbotron replayed old footage. Game 7 of 1,970. Frazier in blue and white, passing, shooting, smiling, embracing Willis Reed amid a sea of fans. When the screen froze on the moment the silver trophy was raised, the crowd stood as one. The city seemed to breathe with him, reliving an immortal second. In the honored guests section, Walt sat quietly, hands trembling slightly. A deep purple suit, his familiar fedora, but his eyes were different, softer, hazier, holding a lifetime of light now past. Patricia sat beside him, holding his hand. As the arena lights dimmed, a spotlight hit the screen, showing his face. The crowd chanted, "Clyde! Clyde!" as they once did, but this time, he wasn't the man on the court. He was memory, a witness. He stood, smiled faintly, bowed, tears falling softly. Amid the unending cheers, he spoke into the mic, voice hoarse but resonant. "It's been a beautiful ride, but every ride ends." The applause roared again, long, strong, choked with emotion. Surviving teammates approached to embrace him. Bill Bradley, Dick Barnett, Earl Monroe. They said nothing, just looked at each other, eyes full of understanding. Behind them, the Jumbotron flashed white text, "Thank you, Clyde, for giving New York its soul." The arena fell silent for a moment. Then one voice in the crowd began, "Thank you, Clyde." Thousands joined, a wave of sound rolling on. Walt scanned the stands, each face, each gaze. He saw cold winters when he played through clouds of breath, Red Holtzman at the sideline with a broken pencil, himself young, eyes bright, hair dark. It all appeared, then faded like smoke. He smiled softly, nodded, and whispered, "I can still hear the ball." After the ceremony, he was invited to center court to receive a framed Hassan Zero jersey. He walked slowly, each step trembling but steady. Touching the glass frame, the lights caught his thin hands glinting on the old championship ring. The Garden stood again. It wasn't the roar of a game. It was gratitude for a man who lived his life for this city. As music played, Charles Mingus's Moanin', Walt closed his eyes, nodding to the rhythm, as if his life replayed in a brief melody. Atlanta, Carbondale, New York, Cleveland, Harlem Street, Croy, and back here. A circle closed, beautiful and achingly sad. After the event, he stayed as the arena emptied. Lights dimmed, leaving only faint golden beams in the stands. Walt walked slowly around the court, his polished shoes echoing softly. He looked up at the rafters where his jersey hung, then down at the floor, where he'd spilled blood, sweat, and youth. "You took everything," he said quietly, "but you gave me a life." His voice melted into the empty air, dissolving like breath. At the exit, Patricia waited. She said nothing, just draped a silk coat over his shoulders. He turned for one last look, the garden darkening, lights receding row by row, seats silent. His reflection stretched across the hardwood toward the tunnel, curving like a question mark. A lifetime. From a barefoot boy in Atlanta to a legend in fur, now just that slow silhouette. As the door closed, a narrator's voice rose in the dark, soft, deep, warm, like a farewell. He was the Prince of New York, the man in fur and calm eyes, the voice of elegance. Time took his speed, his friends, his fame, but never his grace. At 80, his tragedy is not that he grew old, but that the world forgot how rare such dignity could be. Outside, New York's night descended. Skyscrapers reflected the garden's fading light. Walt Frazier sat in the car, gazing through the window as the city he loved shrank behind. He said nothing, just smiled faintly. On the radio, a familiar jazz tune played, and he hummed along, voice trembling but rhythmic, swishing and dishing. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, hearing the car's wheels roll over the avenue, a gentle sound, like a legend's final beat. And when the garden's lights went out, that light didn't truly fade. It just moved to another place, where souls still smile in memory. If his story reminds you of the power of silence, resilience, and grace, share it. And remember, legends fade only when we stop listening. Perhaps what pains us most in Walt Clyde Frazier's story isn't just what time took, but what he had to surrender to be seen, then forgotten. From the Atlanta boy in 1945, denied a quarterback spot for being too smart for a colored boy, to the SIU leader lifting the 1,967 NIT trophy, yet unable to smile fully, from the 1,970 Game 7 night with 36 points and 19 assists that set the Garden ablaze, to the Puma contract, turning a man into a brand even his shoes had to perform, we see an America where dreams open doors, but always at a steep price. The deepest cut came when the Knicks traded him to Cleveland in 1977, exile in plain sight, in a sparse Cleveland, each run aching his back, knees creaking, the first time he felt age, then the 1,980 seconds, a quiet Harlem, passing through Times Square unnoticed. The Garden he once ruled now belonged to ghosts, but that same America gave him a way back. The Madison Square Mike. His new court was sound, not wood. His jazz-like commentary, posting and toasting, pulling him from depression. And the 2022 Kurt Gowdy Award, affirming a Frazier twice in the Hall of Fame. At 80, under the Hassan Zero banner and footage of a limping Reed, he said, "It's been a beautiful ride, but every ride ends. Tears falling but back straight. In Street Croy, he talks to ghosts on dawn beaches. nights listening to his young voice. The lesson for Americans today: honor dignity in silence, resilience through injustice, and gratitude not just on tribute days. Fame fades, applause quiets, but grace is a legacy we can share daily. See, name, and never stop listening to those who shaped this city's soul. If you believe legends like Walt Frazier deserve to be remembered forever, hit subscribe and join us in keeping their light alive. Thank you for listening to the story of an icon of resilience and dignity. See you in the next video, where more of America's great souls wait to be retold.